Good morning everyone, the videos are back and today's lesson will be slightly different from what you're used to, since due to some unforeseen complication with the system I will not be able to use Google Forms for this lesson. Instead, what you can do is download the transcript and answer the final question in a new Google Docs and then send it to me. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Back to today's topic, the gentry in Elizabethan England. Today we are setting aside politics and we'll look at society, okay? We'll stop looking at power, at the palace, at the people who took the decision, and we'll look at the wider social developments, at normal people, sort of, and what changed in Elizabethan society. And in particular, today we'll look at one of the basic components of society, which is social class. Social classes are ways to analyze society by dividing it into groups based on either wealth, functioning, lineage, or other characteristics. You might have heard expressions like upper classes, middle classes, and working classes. By far the most frequently used way to analyze a society is by dividing it in groups based on wealth. And in a way, this is how the Elizabethans thought of the societies too. It is a bit more complicated, of course, but there were differences in how a person was located socially according to their wealth, their apparent wealth, how much they showed off, how rich they were. Our focus today will be on the rise of the gentry, which is a form of upper class, that is, wealthy people, which was, however, different from the old nobility in a number of ways. Okay? In particular, we'll look at the following point. We'll see the differences between the nobility and the gentry, what were the two main key differences. And we'll look at the causes of the rise of the gentry, and then I will give you a model answer. Today's question is, why did the Elizabethan period witness the rise of the gentry? So you will have to read the part on the causes and try to understand it. Let's start by defining what was this gentry we talked so much about already. First of all, we need to understand the differences between them and the nobility, which can be summarized in 3 points. First, the nobility had ancient titles and usually had a military upbringing. Okay? So they were for example, the Earl of Sussex, the Duke of Norfolk, Duke, Earl, and so on. Those are titles, okay? And they had a military upbringing, which we will explain later. The gentry did not have any titles. They were just stupendously rich and very rarely had a military upbringing, at least in this period. Third point, most important, both classes were leisure classes or rentier classes, okay? They were groups of rich people with a lot of influence and a lot of money who lived off the rents that were paid them by the tenants, okay? They owned a lot of lands. That was the main source of income. People paid rent to live in those lands and they earned a lot of money. And you know how it is, when you have money, you make more money, so they became absurdly rich. There is a nice table in the transcript summarizing these differences. What needs to be clear is this point, okay? The gentry was not a class of merchants and bankers, or at least it was not the main occupation. The whole idea of an upper class in those days was that you didn't have to work. If you had to work, you were a member of the lower classes and you really have to work to live? Oh, that's ridiculous. So they did not have to do that. The gentry was not a working class. They were not merchants or bankers, or at least it was not their main occupation, their main job. The gentry was a class of rich landowners with a lot of money to spend, who could often use that money to make more money. It's called investing, by buying more lands or by investing in some commercial activities. The nobles had a similar behavior. They were a class of rich landowners with a lot of money to spend, but were often the direct descendants of old medieval knightly family and had a host of military duties. For example, throughout the early modern period, recruiting, training, paying, and leading soldiers was often their responsibility. Many nobles saw war and fighting as the ultimate reasons for the existence of a nobility in the first place. They were very much into the old tripartite medieval system in which there were people who worked, everyone else, people who prayed, and people who fought and protected the realms, and they saw themselves as those who fought. These, of course, were not clear-cut differences, okay? It was not absolute differences. There were many members of the gentry who led armies. Great example is Oliver Cromwell, one of the greatest early modern English generals, even though he lived a century later. And there were also many nobles who did business. By and large, however, this was the main difference between the gentry and the nobility. It rested in the gentry's lack of noble titles and of military vocation. The gentrys were rich and they were generally not soldiers. Okay? Now, what caused these families, who, as we said, had no title, to become important? Again, they had no title, so they were not part of the medieval and late medieval upper classes like the nobles. So we should ask ourselves, when did they become rich and important, and how? As everything in history, it is complicated. We should start answering this question by looking at the Black Death. Now, you remember from Health and the People, the Black Death was the epidemic of bubonic plague, pandemic of bubonic plague that invested Europe and killed more or less between a third and a half of the population after 1346 and remained endemic. So, as you might be aware by now, pandemics do change societies, often by killing large numbers of people who would have not died otherwise. The Black Death did exactly that. It became endemic, so it did not go away immediately and remained and was able to keep the population low for a while. And it killed a lot of small landowners whose land were grabbed, legally or illegally. It was the Middle Ages. It was in the middle of the most devastating pandemic in human history. So legality was a bit of a fuzzy issue. And so those who survived took the lands of those who died. This put those small landowning families on the property ladder, so to speak, okay? From having a small field and a small plot of land, they started having larger plots of lands and larger fields that they started to rent. So this Black Death gave them the resources necessary to expand in the following centuries. Another great turning point in the creation and expansion of the landed gentry came during the reign of Henry VIII, okay? Famous for lots of wives and the thing with the Pope. The thing with the Pope in that he cut off the ties with the Church of Rome, and part of this process was also dissolving the monasteries, which happened in 1536. So monastic land that belonged to the monastery, covered around a quarter of the entire land of England. It is not little, okay? It was huge. It was a huge amount of land, which was suddenly for sale by the government. A lot of rich people, including the descendants of those who had grabbed all that other land in the late Middle Ages, a lot of rich people saw this as an occasion to become even richer, okay, and started buying these properties, this plot of land, increasing what would now be called their real estate portfolio. They had a lot of land, now they had massive amounts of land because all of a sudden a quarter of the entire land in the country was for sale, very cheaply. As we've seen, the gentry was also good at investing money in commercial ventures, okay? And there were a lot of those in the 16th century. The major example that comes to mind is the Virginia Company, founded in 1606. Yes, it's 3 years after the death of Elizabeth, but it still counts as Elizabethan, sort of. Now, the Virginia Company aimed at establishing trade with the New World. Most of the investors were members of the gentry, and they made a lot of money out of it by selling manufactured products to America entering the slave trade, buying cash crops and selling them in Europe, this sort of things. We studied the triangular trade and all that. The gentry entered this new world and all the commercial possibilities that it offered and made a lot of money out of it. Furthermore, there were other venues for economic expansions for the gentry. The population during Elizabethan England increased a lot. When there is more people, you need more food. And when people need more of anything, the prices go up. So the gentry controlled much of the land that produced much of the food. So when the prices increased, they made a lot of money. However, one of the most important reasons for the rise of the gentry as a politically important class, because so far we have discussed the reasons why they gained a lot of money, but while generally money equals political power, this is not always the case, okay? There is generally something must happen so that an economically and financially important social class also becomes politically important. And the reason why is that the Tudors did not trust the noble, okay? This was true since the very beginning. For example, King Henry VII, the first Tudor king, won the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. I wrote 1458 in the transcript, yeah? So, he won the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the one which gave him the throne and started the Tudor dynasty, because one of the nobles fighting for his enemy Richard III, this noble was called Sir William Stanley, betrayed him, took his men, and joined the Tudor side, charging from behind his former king, and therefore giving the victory to Henry VII. From that moment onwards, Henry, as grateful as he might have been, became incredibly aware that the nobles, who were good at waging war and commanded the loyalty of these large private armies and retinues that they called affinities, could constitute a threat. The same way that the betrayal of a noble gave him the throne, maybe another rebellion from another nobleman down the line would take the throne away from him and his family. It was a very legitimate concern. So he started penalizing them. He started forcing them to pay steep fines if they had large affinities, started creating a monopoly, a state monopoly on artillery, so that the king was the only one who could use big modern guns to tear down the castles of the nobles. He also increased the power of the smaller nobility without titles, and here we start seeing how the gentry starts entering into the picture. His successors took very similar decisions, and Elizabeth, especially after the Northern Rebellion of 1569, which we studied last time, realized that the nobles could still be a threat, and therefore decided to privilege the gentry in her Privy Council. She gave the most important positions to people like William Cecil or Francis Walsingham, came from the landed gentry, and generally only allowed nobles to have military roles, as she did with the infamous Earl of Essex, the one who entered the room, started this comically tragic rebellion, and so on and so forth. But he was a noble and he had a military post. This is not a coincidence. This opened the door, this change in the preferences of the royal power, opened the door of power and patronage to the landed gentry. Remember, we talked about patronage. Patronage was the key. If you know a guy who knows a guy, then you will get favors, then you will get a job, then you will get money. The Tudors' mistrust of the nobility opened to the gentry, who were non-nobles and were seen as the new guys, the ones who are not worthy, the ones who do not descend from ancient families. This opened them the doors of political power, and they started becoming a hugely important social class during the Elizabethan period. And essentially within 150 years, until Towards sort of, I think, the end of the English Civil War, the nobility and the gentry essentially were the same, became the same social class. There were only minor differences. So, we have discussed what is the gentry, what are its differences with the nobility, and the causes of the rise of the gentry, which we can summarize as black debt allows a lot of people to gobble a few people to gobble and buy a lot of land. Second, what was the other? Sorry. Yes. Dissolution of the monasteries allows these families to gain even more land. Third, the gentry was good at investing money and at becoming even more rich by exploiting the situation. For the Tudor monarchs really did not trust the nobility, and this was pretty common throughout Europe in this phase. So, those were the facts. Now open a Google Doc, answer the question. There is a model answer in the transcript, as always, and I'm looking forward to read your work. See you next time.